Well, I'd like to welcome Stephanie Zelnick and Lauren Jacobson to this newest podcast episode of the ICA Health and Wellness Committee. Thank you for accepting the invitation. Um, Before we start, let me introduce them a little bit, and this will be from the perspective of Summit Musicians. Summit Musicians was founded in 2022 by Stephanie Zelnick, professor of clarinet at the University of Kansas, and Lauren Jacobson, professor of clarinet at the University of Northern Colorado. Created to bring awareness to musicians' health, women in music, and the connection to the landscapes around us, Summit Musicians started a concert series on top of the highest peaks in Colorado. They soon caught the attention of local media and were featured twice on 9 News Denver and approached by Colorado Public Radio to air their future works. So again, welcome to this episode.
Thank you so much for having us, Chava.
Well, both of your names are very well known in the clarinet world, and though I introduced you from a Summit musician's perspective, you have an extensive bio on the webpage of the University of Kansas and Northern Colorado, and have given master classes throughout the world. Let me just ask you, what is Summit Musicians? How do you come to organize that company or organization, and what it does? What do you guys do in that?
Lauren, do you want to go ahead?
Well, Summit Musicians really began because Stephanie is conducting research on high altitude playing and musician health, which she can talk in more detail about. But she had asked me to perform one specific piece of music at different altitudes to gather some data points on our experiences. So for me, that was at 5,000 feet in Fort Collins, Colorado. And then we performed at 11,000 feet at the trailhead for Mount Audubon. And we performed the same piece at above 13,000 feet at the peak of Mount Audubon. And then again at the peak of Mount Bierstadt, which is above 14,000 feet, to just gather data about our experiences and how it felt to play at these various altitudes. And we had such a great time, and the audiences on top of these mountains loved it. They were thrilled, and we had people talking to us on the way, down from the mountain. Oh, we heard there's a concert at the top. Is it still happening? And on one of the hikes, I had my clarinet in this big tube, and everyone was asking, what's in that big tube? So that I could fit it inside of my hiking backpack. So it garnered a lot of interest, and we realized this is great. We should do this more often.
Absolutely.
We also, when we were up doing one of these performances, somebody up there grabbed a video, and it actually made it onto the news in Denver. They hadn't received our names at that point, but somebody that we knew said, "Oh, you were in the news as these two mysterious clarinetists playing on top of this, one of the highest peaks." And then the news actually reached out to us, and we had a little short feature on 9 News Denver, which is neat. We realized there's a lot of interest for this tie-in between classical music and nature, a lot of which supports our research, but kind of a great side benefit is that people are really interested in the connection between music and nature.
Absolutely. Thank you.
And between music and health, because I remember actually during that interview with Kyle Clark on 9 News, you talked about the differences between musicians and athletes, non-musician athletes, I should say, because I believe that we are athletes as well.
Yes.
But you talked about the longevity of our careers, yep, and sort of the dearth of research resources and other funding and things like that for musicians as compared to professional sports athletes. So I also think that's of interest not only to musicians but to a broader audience.
Yeah, absolutely. Like Chava, you know this as well. What we do is tremendously taxing and so physical in front of a live audience, a lot of physical and emotional and mental stressors to what we do. And, if you're a football team, you're going to have, these physiologists and therapists and everything supporting you, even with a game and a lot of modalities and attention. Just like what Lauren was saying, we don't receive really any of these supports as musicians while we're doing a lot of repetition and dealing with a lot of stressors. And really the statistics are there that it does have long-term impacts on our health as well. We're not quite as bad as rock musicians when it comes to longevity, but we definitely deal long-term with a lot of implications on our wellness and conditioning in our lives. So it's ridiculous the support we get for all of that.
And I think I recall, and I don't remember if I read it from you, Stephanie, or I heard it, but you were saying that musicians, they have to deal with one profession and the demands of that profession, which is high on the mental as well as on the physical body, for 40, 50, and sometimes 60 years. A sport where retires in their 30s, maybe early 40s, but musicians, they have to keep playing and performing at the same rate they had done before. Now, my next question would be, well, I think addressed Lauren, what was your experience playing at different altitudes? I don't know if that was a Telemann or which pieces you tried at different altitudes.
It was the Telemann. We did realize that particular duet is taxing, even at an altitude where we're adjusted. For me, 5,000 feet is somewhat normal because that's where I live. Yes, we did observe that it got harder as you go up in altitude, and we've both performed in orchestras and as recitalists at high altitudes as well. So that was no surprise. I think one thing that we observed on Mount Audubon in particular, which was a lower mountain, was that our embouchure muscles became fatigued, and even the fingers. It was like the oxygen deprivation might have been having an impact on the musculature and how it was performing. It also might have been because we felt, I felt, and I think you did too, Stephanie, you can tell me, but I felt actually a little better a few weeks later when we climbed the 14,000 foot peak. It was a little warmer on the 14,000 foot peak, but I also wonder if it had to do with conditioning. We had already played at such a high altitude that maybe our bodies had adjusted slightly. There's a lot more data to be gathered. And I know Stephanie has discussed trying to get some sensors and oximeters and things like that to gather even more data on and be able to parse out some of these details, because it's pretty fascinating. But yes, it was harder. And the reeds do feel much, much stiffer the higher you go. So that was also a challenge. We were playing on cane reeds and normal equipment. So.
Absolutely. No, I actually recall a concert when the quintet of the Berlin Philharmonic Orchestra came to Utah and we played. And the altitude was, I believe, 700 feet high where they played, and the clarinet player, especially the clarinet player, had really, really hard time playing his clarinet. He wasn't prepared to play at a high altitude that changed the strength of the clarinet. He did not make any mistakes throughout the whole concert, but he was struggling to do what he wanted to do, so it does make a huge difference in the clarinet playing. If I remember these excerpts that I have seen on YouTube, both of you performing Telemann a duet, they were really short excerpts, 30, 40, 50 seconds. Let me ask, how long could you actually perform in one go at that altitude, which is, I believe, more than 14,000 feet?
Yeah, we had some that were longer takes, Lauren. I think maybe one of the longest takes was about 3 or 4 minutes, right? But I definitely noticed, and Lauren, you can tell me if I'm right on this, that the longer we were up there, the harder it was, right? Like the first couple times we're like, well, this is kind of difficult. But then as we started doing it more and more, we had even more fatigue. And it was really interesting, exactly what Lauren's saying, that I've done a lot of concerts really high. I've played concerts up at 10,000, 11,000 feet before. My opera company in Central City, Colorado is at 9,000 feet. And that's full operas for a long time. But this extreme elevation, we don't really condone going and playing up there, but it's interesting to kind of optimize performance at more normal elevations. So what Lauren was saying, that what I was surprised that it wasn't just so much the deprivation of kind of lung, oxygen type involvement, but more this musculature of like hands and embouchure. It was like the body is really prioritizing the brain, obviously, and the heart, and not prioritizing your digits or your embouchure muscles at that point. So what I'm doing a lot of in my research, and Lauren, I think you're interested in this too, is like, what can we learn from these elevations when we come back down? And one of them is just something we all know as clarinet, is this importance of breathing. Because if you're in a performance situation and you are kind of taking shallower breaths and not kind of maintaining that good CO2 threshold, proper oxygenation, proper release of CO2, building your CO2 threshold in your practicing, then you might be making mistakes as a performer, not because you're not prepared, but because you're simply oxygen deprived, because you're not using your oxygen exchange efficiently. So that's just kind of one of the, outcomes that we're seeing from this research. The other thing that's a really good outcome is if you do something really hard in your practicing, when you go back to performing normally, it's a lot easier. So my orchestra is out in Colorado, but my job's in Kansas, so that's about a mile of altitude difference. That sometimes I would do like once a month. And I would find when I'll come back to Kansas, there was a lot of implications for my playing and my endurance. So obviously, if you have an audition, not everyone can afford to go up to like 5,000 or 10,000 feet, nor do we suggest it. But what can you do at the same elevation that would sort of build in that proper oxygenation, CO2 threshold type thing? So I think we're looking into kind of maximizing optimal performance using the experiences of sort of adverse conditions.
Absolutely, thank you. That leads to one of my questions. You mentioned that you had played at 10,000 feet before, and was that condition climate controlled, even though it was high elevation? Was it an inside performance where those adverse conditions that you had experienced at 14,000 feet were not really present the same way?
Well, that's a great question. Kind of goes back to what Lauren was saying too, that definitely I think the cold was an issue on that first performance that we did. That definitely had a lot to do with it. Though I do also wonder, we're kind of trying to figure out how much the conditioning changed between performances. But yeah, definitely if you're outside in some crazy adverse conditions, and we were both playing on old clarinets, I was playing on a Bundy, so never take, a good clarinet outside. But yeah, when I performed on top of Aspen Mountain, which I believe is about like 10,000 feet or so, that was outside, but kind of a warm day. But a lot of those issues exist even in like the Opera House, for example. I think Central City is at 9,200 feet, and that was about 7 hours of performing a day a lot of times. And so the issues more at that elevation, they were breathing, and then you would definitely, have to work on maybe nerves a little bit more at that elevation too, because a lot of it's like perceived panic. If you feel like you're not oxygenated enough, you're definitely less able to kind of calm down because you're having that perceived panic to not having enough oxygen. Something I'm working on with my research too is just getting people to play a little bit longer when it comes to phrasing and not panicking so much that we feel like we need to take breaths. I know we've all seen this with students too. They're like, I have to breathe. And it's like, well, no, if you kind of just slow your heart rate down and relax, you actually don't need to breathe that soon, and that doesn't mean that the music doesn't ask for that breathing at that duration. Usually it does. It's usually an organic amount of time that we should take a breath in musically, and especially in tonal music. But just that feeling that you don't have to take a breath is very comforting as a performer. so that was definitely something that playing at that high altitude at normal circumstances, that I was going to have enough air.
Okay.
Yeah, and I feel like, I mean, one experiment we did on top of the 14,000 foot peak, Mount Bierstadt, was I tried to play Beethoven 6 Movement 1, which is a challenge to make it through in one breath, and in Colorado in general. And it was a challenge for me even at sea level when I lived on the East Coast for 7 years. And I found, I have done experiments on that particular exercise, on that particular excerpt, that it almost doesn't matter how big of a breath I take, you know, at the beginning of that excerpt. What matters is how relaxed I am. And so we did the experiment on top of the peak. I was able to make it through no problem with a relaxed body going into it. And so I think there is some value to what you were just saying, Stephanie, and also, you know, having students exactly like work through that panic response and being able to remain relaxed and trust that they will be able to make it. Maybe performing things slightly under tempo, so the phrases are a bit longer, so that when the pressure is on, you know, that's that conditioning. So when the pressure is on, they can make it and have confidence that they'll make it through a long phrase.
That's such a great point. That's such a great point, Lauren. Like, one of the exercises I would do up in Central City is if I had like a phrase I was worried about, I would either play at half speed, like let's say it was a super long phrase, I would try to play at half speed, and I realized, oh, I can actually make it more, I can almost do it for the whole excerpt if I set my mind to it and just relax.
Mm-hmm.
Or I would do it twice. So sometimes if you have a student who's worried about something, you have them, okay, I know you're scared about getting to the end of it, but why don't you just go back and immediately repeat that phrase without taking a breath? And there's just, they're like, oh, I can play this for 1.5 times.
Yeah.
And so you don't have to worry. Just, and it was amazing watching you on that Beethoven excerpt, because we'll have to post, we should post that part of it, is that breath that you took before it. You knew it was going to be a success, right?
Yeah. I just took a very relaxed, just took a moment to relax my body. I was sitting on a rock.
It was amazing. It wasn't, like you said, it wasn't like a really forceful breath. It was just so relaxed.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, that actually taps into a little bit of my research, if it's okay to talk about that, Chaba, where I conducted a survey of over 250 clarinetists and presented on that survey at the last ICA conference in Reno. But it was researching what language we're using to teach breathing, and our knowledge of anatomy, and how we feel about our knowledge of anatomy. But one thing that inspired that research project was, I have a hunch that some of the language you're using to teach breathing is actually increasing tension and decreasing efficiency. And so we need to do more research to really draw that correlative data. But I mean, what we're talking about is right on point with that. And that if we're using our air efficiently, and if we're in good condition, and if we've trained well for making phrases, and we're in a relaxed body, you know, and mind state, then we can make these phrases. And that maybe, you know, some of the takeaways from my research were simply to think carefully about the language that we use when we teach, and what we use, the language we use when we're coaching ourselves through our practice, to ensure that it's not actually making us more tense or tight when we're playing.
Yes, absolutely. One of the recurring phrase that I hear in education, music education, is a back straight, which actually produces tension. That's most of the time. That is very weird. I'd like to go back just one. I had one question regarding high altitude, and then we can circle back to research. Besides preparing or practicing phrases longer, or we slow down the tempo, what are some of the things you both suggest clarinetists do when they face an upcoming high altitude performance?
Well, I have an article I wrote for the Clarinet Journal. Gosh, I don't know when it is, 6 or 7 years ago. That's exactly on that. So check that out in the Clarinet Journal. It's a 4-page article on performing at high altitude. And Lauren, I think you're in that article also. I've been a big fan of Lauren's work for a long time. And a lot of clarinetists have some good research on this. Somebody who turned me on to the lessons of athletes was Joshua Meets, who teaches up in Casper, Wyoming. And he had talked a lot about studying the habits of ultra runners who, for example, for my book, I just interviewed the winner of the Leadville 100, this running race that goes over high peaks. It's a 100-mile run. And just kind of trying to learn from athletes, right? And like what they're doing without the clarinet, what their habits are. So if you get to play at high altitude, there's certain things you can do. Josh had a good point. I realized I did this for a long time too, is to get some exercise in even before you touch the clarinet. Joshua's method, and I think it has a lot of validity, is to kind of shock the system. You know, the kind of common wisdom is you get out there and you rest, you take it easy that first day. And I have to say, I have a lot of experience at high altitude, so does Lauren, so does Joshua. So for somebody that you really shouldn't mess with high altitude without talking to a doctor first. I have to say this stuff is kind of extreme. Sometimes we don't know a lot about it. So if you have had any medical problems, I would talk to a medical professional first. But Josh was really used to it. He'd done a lot of racing. So he'll always get there and he'll just do a workout right away, even higher than he has to play. And this is what I'll usually do too. Like when I drive from Lawrence out to Boulder, if I have time to get in a hike, even if it's only like 5,000 feet or 6,000 feet or so, but it's a big difference coming from 800 that I live at. So I'll usually try to hike up to like 7,000 or 8,000 before I actually have to play the rehearsal. Eating iron-rich foods can be a thing, like spinach. If you're a meat eater, eat some meat, get some iron-rich foods is a big thing. I usually take a slightly softer reed out with me that I play on out here, or do some work on it when I get out there. I'm really good with a knife. So for me, sometimes it's easier than going down a reed size, but just to kind of work on my reeds a bunch when I get out there. And then I do a lot of long tones. I've got like a really specific long tone exercise. It's kind of based on Marcellus's old long tone exercise where it's so simple. You just kind of progressively slow down the scales. I've got it on my website. But it's just that standard one where you do your scales in 4/4, each note 4 beats, and then, start it at like 100, then come back down at 96. But I think this is really important. The long tones need to be progressive. So don't try to go one speed for the long tones. Start with comfortable speed, really gradually extend the amount of time that you're exhaling that's a big one. There's some other great pulmonology. I'm talking with a lot of physiologists and pulmonologists also about, sometimes it's not really so much lung capacity that we're increasing as much as our CO2 threshold and getting used to carbon dioxide and oxygen exchange levels. So there's some great exercises that you can all just do for relaxing too. Box breathing is a great one, where you just take a breath, for 4 counts, hold for 4 counts, release for 4 counts, hold out for 4 counts, and they call this box breathing. It's also what people do if they have panic attacks or an anxiety attack. So the great thing as a performer, it also kind of calms us down for that. But there's a lot of other great exercises. I'm talking with a lot of free divers, and those are the people who really, really rely on this. Yeah, panic. So they've got a lot of really specific exercises when it comes to, Lauren's talking about this relaxed breath, and then also oxygen packing kind of at the end. So I find if you're going to play an elevation, especially if you're doing a concerto, not just a solo with orchestra, you really need to in a relaxed manner, like Lauren's saying, you really need to also pack that oxygen in a little bit before you play these phrases. So there's a lot of exercises.
That actually reminds me of one thing I read from Arnold Jacobs' book, and he mentioned when someone knows is going to play a long phrase, just like Beethoven's Sixth Clarinet solo in the movement, then just take a series of short breath, inhale, exhale, that pumps up the oxygen level in the body, and then start playing so that the brain doesn't start um, um, and step into emergency mode, wanting to inhale another set of air or oxygen. So that was one thing that I learned. And the other thing I wanted to say escaped my mind. Maybe we'll come back later.
You know, Chuck, another thing, just like you were saying too, though, that's really air packing. The last thing is something a lot of these divers have been talking about too, is just increasing your intercostal space. So much of it, you can't really increase your lung capacity that much, like the lungs you have or what you have, but kind of increasing that diaphragmatic space and those space in the intercostal muscles. So you were talking about spine straight, right?
Yes.
And just increasing the amount of space that we have for the diaphragm and lungs is so important.
Yes,
Stretching.
absolutely. A lot of times we collapse as clarinetists, and so
Yes.
it's a lot harder for the rib cage to move out and up, and it takes a lot more energy to inhale that way, definitely. Oh, the other thing is in connection to your long tones, and what you mentioned that you actually extend the exhalation time as you play the long tone progressively. I have done a couple of experiments a while back in Europe, and in which I just had one long tone, and I measured the first time I how long I could hold it in seconds, and sometimes it was 20, sometimes it was 30 seconds, but by doing that for a couple of minutes a day, in just a few days, I could hold that long tone for over 60 seconds.
Yes.
The same. And I absolutely, it's not about volume, but it's more about how the body manages that oxygen that we inhale. And
Yes.
actually, the other thought came back to me. You mentioned the diaphragmatic space. Um, I think this is a misconception, and I don't know with how many people or clarinetists or musicians in general, wind instrumentalists, but I always thought when I was younger that you increase your capacity when the diaphragm drops down, and then I later learned that actually you increase the lung capacity by the more extension, the more excursion the ribs make. So actually the diaphragm doesn't drop as much; it more extends to the sides, front, back, and the sides, and that makes the rib cage have a nicer support because it is the rib cage eventually that we get that big support. So definitely, I remember also. Sorry, I don't want to take over this conversation. I remember the experience I had. I prepared a piece in Utah, and I knew I was going to perform that in Indiana. So I looked at the humidity level and I looked at the altitude, and I knew that I needed a little bit stronger reed for me in Utah, so that it's nice in Indiana, and it really worked. Really worked. Just that quarter of a strength more reed that was just a little bit strong. It was absolutely perfect.
Yeah, I think so much of the time too, it's the instrument changes as we go kind of higher and drier. So we're not getting so much more resistance from the instrument because obviously if it has all these little micro breaks in the seal, it's a lot more resistant to play through the instrument. So I thought that sometimes at elevation that it's the change to us, but also if the instrument's getting dry, it has all those micro leaks in it.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, when the air gets thinner, the clarinet sounds different. Not just the tone, but um, um, the feature is not the right word for that. The quality of the air changes, how things function, And I remember, if you think about that, when you inhale helium and you play with that, it absolutely changes intonation. It changes the tone color. It's the change in the material that actually um, acts as a transportation for the sound, waves and particles. Um, I remember when I moved to United States, my clarinet cracked after two weeks of practicing.
Oh,
I didn't expose it to outside weather. It was inside practicing and performing all the time. But it did crack, and we had a saying back in Europe that if the clarinet doesn't crack in the first 5 years, you are fine for the rest. And so I had that. I had the clarinet for 7 years, and we moved to the United States, and it cracked in 2 weeks because of the dry weather. So I think that is also another thing to count with when it comes to. Um, but I want to circle back to Lauren's research project. So, Lauren, this research project is still an ongoing project, if I understand correctly, right?
yeah, the data collection is finished and the analysis, but we are in the midst of writing. So we'll be submitting for publication sometime this year. But the survey is complete. We have all of our data. And it was interesting to hear you talk about your conceptualization of the diaphragm and the role and how it changes shape when we breathe. And I was thinking, don't you wish someone would have used different language when you were younger so you could have imagined that spreading and the back, some of these words. So I'm pretty excited about the results of the project, and I think my main goal really was my own curiosity, but also wanting people to start talking more about the language we used, because a lot of the language we use was passed from our teachers, from our predecessors, and so it's perpetuated. But sometimes it's perpetuated without a lot of thought into what we are perpetuating, and so starting the conversation is really one of my primary goals. And it was great. The presentation at ICA last year, people were asking all kinds of questions. We've spilled into the hall and talked for a long time afterwards. And that was really what I was looking for. So this publication will be coming, but I think these kind of conversations are really, really vital for people to just think, I wish someone would have told me how the diaphragm moves more specifically, or use different words, maybe out instead of down, or something like that, to get your mind to imagine how the body is moving a little bit differently.
Absolutely, and I think that we can call it generational, multi-generational problem. This musician's colloquial language used in professional setting, and sometimes it's helpful, sometimes not, when we don't know how that language came about and what is the imagery that is behind. So it is hard to decipher once we are removed from that root person that forced that colloquial language. What are some of the upcoming events we can expect from Summit musicians?
Well, we are going to be playing on the highest points of Colorado and Kansas. The Colorado one is obviously a little bit more dramatic than the Kansas one, but we're going to be doing concerts in August and September on top of Mount Elbert in Colorado and Mount Sunflower in Kansas. The Kansas one is a field, but still it highlights the beauty of this landscape and sort of the geographical extremes that we can play clarinet in. And we're going to be doing pieces by Jared Tate and Tyler Yazzie, some new pieces that are really intrinsically tied with the landscape.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. Well, I know from the accolades, Stephanie, that you're one of the person that likes introducing new pieces to the community. So this will be also a similar event. Well, my question is: there anything else you would like to say or add to what we have already discussed and talked about?
Well, I want to say, Chava, we're really appreciative to you too for your work in this area. And, I love that everyone's kind of taking everything forward with Lauren, you're talking about all your research too, and I just feel like we're looking at new places to take the clarinet forward, sort of new frontiers with our bodies and our mindset, repertoire, and that's just really exciting to see everything that you're doing.
Well, I can vouch for that. Both of you have, as I said, have had extensive performing as well as masterclass experience inland and abroad. So we're grateful for that. We are also grateful for your expertise of venturing out to heights not seen before, and really pushing the limits of the clarinetist and what we can do. We all know, I think, that we have a lot that we can learn, we can educate ourselves, and we can change in the clarinet world so that we become more resilient and less prone to injuries and adverse health effect of the profession. So we are grateful for you coming and accepting the invitation.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Chava.